We have a fantastic speaker with us today. Luke Shaefer is a professor in the Ford School of Policy. He's also the director of Poverty Solutions and a prolific scholar who studies poverty in our country, and has a new book that we're delighted to be able to hear about today. So I'm just going to hand it over. He'll take questions during the talk, and to hear it. Luke.
All right, it's great to be with you. I think of Wisconsin as a place that feels like the closest to home to me as a U of M, public university type, home away from home type thing. So I'm going to tell you about this book. Some years ago, Kathy, Edin, and I wrote a book called $2 a Day. And so this was a book about very, very poor families in the United States, and poor particularly in not having access to cash, to money. So pretty good coverage of food assistance, volatile earnings sort of coming in and out. But what does it mean to go for a month or a calendar quarter without any money? And so that book really started me down my path of doing iterative mixed methods research. So I was primarily a quantitative scholar using large-scale data. Before that, usually survey data, rows of data still and charts still make me feel very warm inside. Maybe my first love, but this project, $2 a Day, sort of impressed upon me in terms of the way that I like doing work and the contributions that I want to make, that by combining the two into conversation with each other, both quantitative work and qualitative work, in the case of that study, repeated sort of interactions, ethnographic, as well as semi-structured interviews with a set of families across multiple field sites, I could learn more than I could from really either one of the types of technologies, right? So because in the qualitative work, you don't know, you can't say that much about the generalizability of what you're seeing on the ground. So I think she and I call what we've been doing as iterative mixed methods, and it often, I think, reveals things that we didn't know going in, and allows us to put the two in the conversation, interrogating, using one to interrogate the other. So we had different field sites, and I think going down to the Mississippi Delta felt like we got a sense that maybe there was a difference in poverty there that we hadn't seen. So she and I, much more her, had spent all of our careers really studying mostly northern cities, right? Chicago in particular, and hadn't spent any time in other parts. And we got this wonderful email out of the blue from a program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I feel like this, maybe there's a few of you where this happens on multiple occasions, but I think this might be the only one for me where like program officer calls me up and says, I want to give you money to do something that you wanted to do anyways. She said, we read $2 a Day. We were really interested in it. Wondered, could you do something like this for communities? Could you do a study of extremely poor communities and try to understand what was going on in them? And so, I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about this, but of course, we were starting to see at the time, this was maybe 2017, sort of more and more stuff emerging about how unequal communities are. And so, we were dealing more and more with life expectancy and the decline in life expectancy, and how that impacts certain communities more than the other. But it's pretty stark to see differences of a decade, just between very little geography of how long somebody could expect to live. We could see these very big differences with infant health outcomes. Clearly, poverty rates are different. So there had been a lot of work around persistently poor communities that had poverty rates of 20% or more using the official poverty measure for a very long period of time. And then we had work coming out from Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hindren and colleagues showing that social mobility really differed a lot. So one of the things I found most striking about their work is just that in some communities, if you grow up low income, you are just as likely as anyone else to rise to the middle class, right? You can see, the median income of lower income people growing up low income sort of being right at the median. In other communities, you are likely to be poor, right? So I think we think a lot about that as like part of the American dream, and to think that that's just completely different across spaces, and like what we want to be true is actually true some places about sort of higher levels of mobility, and very much not in other places. So we decided that we wanted to take this on, and then we decided, like, thinking about all of these different patterns, right, that we've been seeing with the health data, and we've been seeing with social mobility, and we had been thinking a lot about poverty measures and how we collect those data, and all of the challenges with measurement error therein. Wanted to sort of take an approach to this study, say if we're going to do a deep study of extremely poor communities in the United States, how are we going to define that? We wanted to take a multidimensional approach. And so we thought of it as taking 3 factors of high salience to Americans. One is income. Obviously, we weren't going to throw out income. But adding to that, some metrics of health. So we would take life expectancy and infant outcomes. So low infant birth weight being the thing that we could get sort of more variation on across communities. And all of this social mobility data that's coming out. And so from there, we could have these sort of three buckets and 5 indicators. With income, we could see the sort of cyclical, like coming in and out of economic cycles, going up and down, but also persistence. We can see with health sort of cumulative nature of just really like everything that happens to people in their life being shown sort of at the end of life as well as at the beginning. And then the sort of structural question of what our expectations are if we grow up poor. Are we going to be poor or higher income as adults? And the 3 can really, I think, be in conversation with each other. And we think they're like all things that when we think about poverty, or maybe more broadly, when we think about disadvantage, are maybe swimming around in our heads. So we're sort of in the sort of quantitative part of this study wanting to say, how do we pinpoint these communities? You can make arguments about sort of what's the level of community that I should care about. In part, we're sort of dictated by the fact that we want to have consistent data across everything, like whatever our unit is. But also, we were really coming to it from a point of like wanting decision-making sets of communities, right? So often, a lot of the work that had been done on communities, like going back to the truly disadvantaged, had really focused on neighborhoods, which is super useful, but doesn't tell you a lot about how decisions get made, right? A lot of the decisions that impact that neighborhood happen at a broader set of geography. So when we combine those sort of 2 things, both wanting to think of the community as something that has a bit more autonomy about what happens inside it, and also wanting to have consistent data across, we decided to use counties, right? Because county government actually matters a great deal for decisions that are made inside, and also cities. So we're able to get like apples to apples data on every county in the United States and every city, the 500 largest cities. And that gets us down to cities of like 50,000 people. So you're talking about a lot of the cities in the United States. And we're able to get all of the information on on all of these factors. And one nice data check is actually there's some cities that are also counties. So we could actually see in the data that shockingly, they were showing the same results when measured as a county and measured as a city. So what does it give us? It spits us out a map of disadvantage across the United States. And I think the first thing that surprised us that we thought was important, and not that we didn't have any information that this would be true, but when we sort of, we use principal component analysis to basically rank all these 3,100 counties and then the 500 largest cities on this continuum based on these factors. And we've got, you know, I think the first apples to apples comparison between the cities and the counties. And when we look down at the very bottom, sort of that bottom 100, almost all of them were rural communities. So I think out of the bottom 100 of the most disadvantaged places in the United States, something like 9 were actually the cities, and a very small number were urban counties. So disproportionately low compared to how much they make up of my rows. And then as you can see, usually they were clustered. So we don't just have like pockets of deep disadvantage. We have a big cluster here in Appalachia, and then this is the southern cotton belt here going up into the tobacco belt, Mississippi Delta here, and then we've got a cluster in South Texas down here. So we actually have sort of the most disadvantaged, predominantly white part of the United States, most disadvantaged, predominantly Black American part of the United States, and then most disadvantaged Hispanic, Latinx, Mexican American, mostly sort of, although you know, lots of flow across the border, and not only. And then as we go west, of course, we have like these pockets of mostly Native American tribal lands. Interestingly, like not a lot sort of out here, and some of our poverty measurement is sort of, one of the places that would be different is that some of the ways that we've been shifting our poverty measurement have been leading to more poverty in California. And we don't get that. Of course, we're using the official poverty measure, but these other outcomes too. And so I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So we've got these sort of pockets out here, but also a lot of like higher levels of advantage as we go out west. Yeah.
Not sure what you could do with this, but you're gonna end up with fewer places that have large counties at the bottom of your measure, right?
Yeah, so you're thinking that the spread, like a larger county with
Is almost necessarily gonna have a higher variety of people, so it's
Yeah,
unlikely
that's fair.
to be way down at the bottom of this ranking.
Yeah.
And that's gonna, in the West, that's gonna lead you to have.
We're gonna see that.
How much would this change if you also kind of adjust for local prices, given this like cities tend to have higher prices?
Yeah, so this is the thing that sort of I start to it opens a line of inquiry for me, right? So I think we've been very good at thinking about the impact of local prices, like especially high cost of living, and that's obviously, it has a ton of logic around it that we should be accounting for that. But on the other hand, sort of this map gets me thinking about the fact that sometimes those high cost of living are acting as signals for other things. So let's take some of the high cost places. You have maybe a healthcare system that doesn't work exactly like it should for folks, but you actually have a healthcare system, right? So there is actually a hospital. And so a lot of rural communities throughout this region, there might be nothing in the area. You maybe have a public transportation system that doesn't work as well as it should, but you actually have a public transportation system. And then Scott Allard and my doctoral student Shoshana Shapiro have started to show like the disparity in sort of philanthropic giving is very different too. So cities, most of our sort of charitable giving is clustered in cities. And then as Laura Talk shows, much of sort of the grant, you know, in contract-based funding from the federal government actually is concentrated more in cities as well. Yeah.
Oh, If you did this one in color, if you did this chart in color, that would be nice.
Why do you want it in color?
Each of the components after that, high mortality,
Yeah.
poverty, whatever, and then of course, then you pick 5 spots or whatever out, right? But I'm thinking things like ringworm in the south, which you don't find elsewhere, which is
Exactly.
incredibly important local thing that really stunts growth and whatever.
And is directly related to poverty and sort of lack of social infrastructure.
It's an idea that,
Yeah.
you know, I've seen the black and white here, gray and whatever, but it's just a thought.
I thought I was being more accessible by having it graded in black and white. But Tim wants color, so I think so. To get to Jeff's point too, like we do, I think the only thing we can do to address, I think, this limitation is we do have the cities going down, and one of the really fascinating things is too, as we get to know these communities, some of the things I'll just mention is many of them are just as likely for people to report major housing cost problems, right? So the level of high cost burden is similar to the 500 largest cities. It's lower than the handful of places that we have in our head, right? Cost burden in LA and New York is much higher, but these places, because the incomes are so much lower, it doesn't weigh over in terms of the cost burden. And then they're also incredibly unequal. Actually, the Gini coefficients, which didn't go into our initial ranking, the Gini coefficients in the communities that we're in are some of the highest that we actually see in the nation, which was also surprising. We sort of went in expecting these places to be uniformly poor, and they're not. There is still sort of haves and have-nots, which I actually think is, part of the story of the history of these places, right? Is like not just today haves and have-nots, but sort of a long-term history of that. All right, so what's new? We think it's the first apples to apples comparison of all counties and 500 largest cities. The map is not dissimilar to what you would get if you just looked at the poverty rate and compared counties. Although the cities, it might be more or so, but it does give you these interesting insights that we can start to interrogate that I think gets to sort of what Tim is pointing at. So if we just looked at a place like Dimmitt County in Texas, that's not one of our field sites, but it's close to, it would appear as number 45, like the 45th poorest place in the entire country if we're just looking at the poverty rate, but it's actually far up the index when we take into account their strong social mobility and health outcomes. And so I think it tells us something, starting to put different indicators into conversation, start to sort of open up and peel, the layers of the onion and understanding what's going on and what that means. Marion County, that does become one of our field doesn't have a terrible poverty rate. It would be number 400 on the list. But when we look at these other outcomes, it's 138. And then the other thing about putting different outcomes into conversation with each other is it protects us against measurement error in any one. So I have become a proponent, and like anything I do, of trying to triangulate the data as much as possible. So you are you're not relying on one source of data that may have one set of measurement error, but by putting them together, I think we can learn things. So take Radford, Virginia. Radford is a community that has a life expectancy in the CDC data that equates to like some of the very, very poorest countries in the entire world. I don't remember what it was, but I think it was something like 66 years old, which would be, devastating. In part because we actually drove through there, because Kathy and Tim did this sort of external, this windshield validation where they've driven now through like 75% of the poorest 200 places according to our index, and the town looks pretty nice. And so we went back and looked, and the poverty rates aren't that bad, and the social mobility rates are pretty strong, and so that meant we ended up not believing that it has one of the worst life expectancies, and it is one of these places that is actually both a city and a county, and so there may be some denominator going on with the CDC.
I was wondering if you would comment on, so the health outcomes are maybe what, like 5 years old or, you know,
Yeah.
but the COI is this, is different. The mobility is different because you're really thinking about kids that were born there, what, 40 years ago, you know?
Yep.
Yeah, and so to the extent that you think communities may have undergone major shifts between the 80s and today, you're actually anchoring back to what they were, not what they are today. And so how do you think about that from a temporal perspective and what it means?
Yeah, I like to think it like shows the advantage of having all three sets of domains in conversation with each other, because if the other two had gotten much better, it would have the mobility won't it's only mobility exerting a third of the weight, right? That it would have if like we only selected on that. More broadly though, there's incredible persistence, I think. So I think every indication is that there are examples of communities that can make strides or not. But the story is one of more persistence than we would have thought. I'm gonna just put an example that maybe illustrates a little bit of this. So here's our map blown up. And here's a map of the concentration of enslavement in 1860. And so this is sort of, as we're talking in our research team, we're starting to see, this is not the only map that would show like significant sort of correlation and not just the general pattern, but the very deep grading of our map, which is collected with data from, says, in this case, we're in the late 20-teens, right? We take all our data right before COVID. The jetty that's sort of going back to a cohort from 1980. And these are outcomes from 150 years before. So this doesn't tell us anything about sort of the causal mechanisms, right? It doesn't tell us like exactly how we should think about this, but it does, I think, suggest significant persistence in these patterns over time in the overall whole. And I think as social scientists, it led me to a place of, I had always had thoughts about history, right? Like, I think we're all steeped in history. We often give a nod to history, but then we often conduct our analyses, you know, in more of a way that sort of suggests our problems appeared out of thin air without taking sort of history into context as much as we should. All right, so we've got the 2 lines of inquiry, mixed methods, large scale data allows us to build this multidimensional index, which I do think we could, the one problem with these indexes is we could debate about them endlessly. But we can see sort of both the benefits of having 3 sort of a multidimensional approach that can tell us more than any one factor, and the level of sort of consistency in terms of our findings, whatever the outcomes might be. And then the qualitative research can deepen our understanding of the communities, and we think maybe give us like the first shed of sort of thoughts on more about the mechanisms, right? And trying to understand what are the things that lead to the persistence of poverty over time. So we work with a set of research of these are our students and staff who, along with us, each one of our research team embedded in a set of communities. Let's see if I jumped around a little bit for Catherine, so I'm trying to find out, not to blame you. So out of our index, we end up sort of clicking 4 field sites. So we've got Clay County in eastern Kentucky, right in the middle of one of these areas. LaFleur County, and that's Greenwood, Mississippi. And then Marion County is in South Carolina. So this is the one where the poverty rate actually isn't that low, but the other outcomes are terrible. And then down here in South Texas, Zavala. And our students embed in these places for the first one is about 8 weeks. So each one goes down for about 8 weeks. And as investigators, Kathy and Tim and I are going in and out constantly. So we do at least 25 interviews with low-income families in each site, and 25 interviews with community leaders over the course of that 8-week period, and then engage in as much sort of participant observation of going to parades, going to whatever community events there are, and being engaged in the community, and then come back over time. And so we can take the quantitative to sort of figure out what our field sites are going to be, do the qualitative work, and then try to take the qualitative work to then go back and test sort of what we think some of the mechanisms are that are leading to persistent poverty with quantitative tests. So as we're meeting in our teams, we're starting to talk about sort of what we're finding in each one of the places that we're in. And one of the very first sort of things like people are talking about, it's like, did you know that that Crystal City, Texas, in Zavala County, is the self-proclaimed spinach capital of the world? And so Crystal City actually has 2 to 3 6-foot statues of Popeye to commemorate this. And we all have selfies with everybody who was down has a selfie with Popeye. But in Crystal City, basically, you have ranching going on sort of at the start of the 20th century. And then we figure out irrigation from underwater springs. And it makes sort of the farming of produce possible and becomes sort of a haven for spinach and onions and all sorts of like tabletop vegetables. And actually all of the big ranches get sort of subdivided into farms. And there is this like actually migration from the Cotton Belt in the South as plantations in the 1920s and 1930s are starting to, cotton is very extractive of the soil. And so people are, it's getting harder basically to make a buck. And so there's people in sort of the early 20th century who report sort of going through the Cotton Belt and seeing these signs that say "Gone to Texas," GTT. And so a lot of the same families are who own plantations now are owning farms in South Texas. Of course, in the Mississippi Delta and the rest of the Cotton Belt, LaFleur County was the cotton capital of the world. And the yearly big event is the Cotton Bowl, and there's a cotton queen who's, there's actually pretty much a something queen in every community that we're in. And this, of course, cotton becomes not just something that's important to the regional economy, but financed by northern banks and sent all over the country, and then actually all over the Western world, right? All produced first based on the labor of enslaved people, and then through Jim Crow tenant farming. And down, of course, in South Texas, it's being produced. The key labor is actually Mexican American labor that's coming up across the border, and there's a construction of this migratory labor pattern where they work in South Texas and then go up through the Midwest, Colorado, and Minnesota, and then to Michigan for cherries and back. So once again, we see sort of an extractive industry that is central to the national, and in the case of cotton, the international sort of development during the early 20th century. Then, of course, in South Carolina, you have tobacco. So actually, the community we're in, Marion County, ends up being the place where they figured out bright leaf tobacco, which is what allows us to actually start making cigarettes. And that's what popularizes smoking across the entire world, right? Again, first through enslaved labor, but through Jim Crow and sort of the the punishing sort of profound sort of need for a very large labor supply. And then as we get up to Appalachia, we have first timber and salt actually become the first sort of massive industries, and then it goes to coal. And it's a much less violent oppression, but you have a scenario where the coal companies actually own everything in the town, right? If you've heard the term company town, right? So they own not just the mines, but the houses and the restaurants and the store town, so that when coal sort of goes into decline, everything sort of is decimated at once in one period of time. So a history, each one of these places, we, I think, have studied the stories of each one in particular, but in this book, we try to make the case that while each field site has its own unique history, it also has a common theme. Right? Place of intensive resource extraction that's dominated by one industry with profound human exploitation, really not seen at a large scale in other parts of the United States. There is a small set of elites that build wealth off of a large group of laborers, and both the economic and social relations are sort of patterned to reinforce this dynamic. One industry is linked to national and or global markets and comes to dominate the economy, a pattern that broadly holds until the 1960s, until in each case, each one of these industries collapsed. And it emerged, sort of this pattern really emerged or came to its full fruition in the late 19th century, sort of hitting its zenith in the 1920s. So we are actually producing more cotton and sort of flowing through the international economy more in LaFleur County in the late 19th century than through Jim Crow and through tenant farming than we were before. So this leads us to sort of our provocative thesis, which is that perhaps we should think of these places like colonies, internal colonies. So thinking of them as places where the large mass of people have sort of like citizenship, don't have the full access to the range of citizenship because of the control of a small group of people who control every aspect of the communities, and social relations are sort of patterned to continue that, perpetuate that over time.
I think about the one example of the counties on your map who are dark that don't really fit this economic schema for Native American, poor Native American economies. But maybe they do fit the very last conclusion you had there about the colonization.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the book, we really wanted to have a Native American field site. And I spent quite a bit of time building that, but I don't know if I know Bobby's written a great paper about tribal lands, right, and per cap and other development. In terms of working with Native American communities, it takes a really, really long time, and you know, there is this like deep level of distrust being researched, and we were making some headway. I like to think maybe we would have gotten there, and then this like global pandemic happened, and like everything shut down, and especially like the tribes shut way down to sort of anybody, like literally some of them like blocked the borders, right? Because they were so hit by the COVID pandemic. So we really acknowledge that as like part of the story of deep disadvantage in the United States that that we aren't able to weigh in on. Although one of the interesting things is when you look at the map, we see an awful lot of the places at the other side of the index in the upper Midwest. Right, so that was another thing. We can say both that if the way we're doing things is reasonable, the most disadvantaged places are disproportionately rural. The most advantaged places are also disproportionately rural in Minnesota, some in North Dakota, although we're seeing like some of that's being chipped away in very recent papers. And one of the strongest correlates that we found so far with making no causal arguments is that these places were actually disproportionately impacted by the 1862 Homestead Act that led to sort of widespread property ownership across the community rather than being concentrated in one or two places. But of course, those lands were all extracted from Native American peoples, and sort of they continue to be shifted, and there's a bloody history. So even sort of these stories of, I think, a very important lesson about like the vibrancy of communities and having sort of broad-based property ownership has this sort of long-term extractive history. So in some ways the stories are similar, and as you say, like there are parallels, but it's also a different story that I think does need to be told. All right, so the book really spends most of its time on mechanisms, and I'm going to talk about three in particular. So just to run through them, we talk about separate and highly unequal schools. One of my favorite passages of the book is about segregationist academies, which are private schools that crop up in the South after this communities can no longer basically ignore Brown versus education, Brown v. Board, sorry. And so there's a story of private schools basically like pulling all of the like the resources out of public schools, and like, yeah, there's actually the Citizens Council, which is or sometimes called the Uptown Klan, that is all about sort of perpetuating white dominance, has like a how-to in the 1960s has a how-to guide in their magazine about how to start a segregationist academy. So really sort of, I think the book tries to get into the nuts and bolts about how deeply unequal schools are created and led to persist over time. Later on, we talk about systemic racism, in this case in disaster relief policy. So we find that like if a community gets hit by a hurricane, if it's a higher income or predominantly white community, it actually ends up more affluent in the long term. And if it's a very poor community or predominantly a community of color, it ends up less affluent. And a lot of that has to do with like who's able to get help when their home is hit by a hurricane or flood. We tell a story about revolt and retribution and sort of the cycle of people rising up and then the consequences that they pay as a result. And then sort of social reproduction of the system through different economics. So I just highlight that. That's what maybe you'll pick up the book and want to read more about. Today, I'm just going to try to talk about three, the loss of social infrastructure, violence, and then government corruption. Let's start with the loss of social infrastructure. So again, right, with this type of inquiry, we end up a little bit at the mercy of respondents and not being able to like be fully in charge of sort of our research agenda, our research question going in. In Clay County, Kentucky is where this particular line starts. This is a community that's still being absolutely ravaged by the opioid epidemic. You know, I think we like to think that we've gotten a handle on that as a nation, but actually opioid deaths are as high as they've ever been. More so in illegal, we've done sort of, we're doing less of prescribing people. But as we start to talk about this with community members, talking about what could be done, this really interesting answer crops up. Hey, Tim, it's in color. So there's really nothing around here to do for kids. That's why they go to drugs. So that's sweet pea. I just want things to change. I mean, better for the kids, better for teenagers, stuff that teenagers can do. So that's from Dolly. Like I said, we had the movies long ago, and now it's turned into a church, and there ain't nothing really to do for the youngins to do. Down here, they want to build more roads and drugstores. Actually, Manchester, which is the town we're in, I think is 1,300 residents. They have 13 drugstores there. There's nothing for you to really do around here. So, you know, when we first started hearing this over and over again, at least like I didn't really take it seriously. It sort of doesn't sound like a serious, like a causal story to me. But when you hear it over and over again from like literally every single respondent, then you kind of have to take it seriously if you believe in the sort of way about doing the work. So we didn't just hear it here. Of course, we heard it in every community we're in, right? There's nothing to do. And so what do they mean by nothing to do? We think that they mean like kind of cheap fun, right? Things where people can come together and that you can actually see a little bit of a leveling of sort of social strata and like who can go to the movie theater, who can go to the bowling alley, right? So maybe it's not just that we're bowling alone, but maybe the bowling alley itself is gone, right? And what does it mean when there's like no place to show up at? Arcades actually appear to be sort of a social infrastructure building type institution. And of course, fewer people are going to arcades and more people are playing video games in their home. Some cases, like a lot of video games, I know. You know, Eric Kleinenberg calls this sort of concept social infrastructure. And so what does social infrastructure do for us? Well, there's like the substitution effect that I can either be doing drugs or I can be going to the bowling alley or going to the splash park or something like that. And then there is the social connection that social infrastructure can help foster. So the linkages with people and both for finding job opportunities, right? So I find Raj's Facebook analysis actually pretty interesting, but also like the cognitive benefits of social connection. Right? So each one of these communities is sort of in the space of total social isolation, where there's nothing to do and sort of people are in their homes, and there's some other structural reasons we're going to talk about in the next mechanism for why that might be. But that means that people, there's a lot of evidence to suggest people are craving that sort of social connection and it can be meaningful in their lives. All right, so what's the circumstantial evidence that this might be true? Well, we do have sort of a map that has some similarities to our other map. This is a map of volunteering. And we can see like the lowest levels of volunteering are clustered in the regions that we're looking at. Not total correspondence on this map, but definitely similarities. There is research that shows sort of declines in civic organizations within communities are associated with increases in opioid deaths. And our own work on this, which is not sort of an analysis that we're gonna bet our firstborn children on, but is I think circumstantially useful, is that actually declines in things like the number of arcades in communities and bowling, like barbershops. That's another one. Actually are associated with increases in opioid overdoses and deaths. Two other really interesting studies. One is on laboratory rats. So if you'll forgive the comparison of rats to humans. It turns out like isolated rats in the laboratory, if they're given access to drugs, they are likely to become addicted and then and many times overdose. And if the same little laboratory rat has little laboratory rat friends in the cage and stuff to do in the cage, almost none of them will become addicted, and nobody will overdose and die. So there's this, I think at least from animal science, a suggestion that sort of the social connection and stuff to do can change our susceptibility to these things. And the other one that I enjoy a lot is from Angus Deaton. So I wrote him to ask about this, and he said, another corollary is actually Vietnam. So American soldiers in Vietnam did drugs in mass quantities in Vietnam. Richard Nixon was like really upset about this, but it turned out drugs were cheap and there was like nothing to do most of the time. Interestingly, when American soldiers came back, we have actually a pretty nice study on this. When American soldiers come back to the United States to their jobs and well-structured family lives, maybe not well-structured, but more structured family lives, that drug use declines at to a degree that we've never been able to understand. Even people who would have shown to be extremely addicted, right? When they're moved into a more structured life, sort of taken out of those circumstances, they reduced drug use at ways that we wouldn't have thought was possible otherwise. So what's the policy implication? Of course, maybe things that we think are not serious actually are things we should be doing. Should we be building splash pads? Should we be building more arcades or bowling alleys? And how could we assess that? Go ahead.
So two things you haven't spoken about that I think of as, say, big in Texas are churches, religion, and sports.
Yeah, I think sports are a great example, right? And you see in the community, in the South Texas community where we're at, there was it actually was the marching band was the most popular thing. But this was the community where everybody sort of rallied around the marching band, showed up at the marching band. And it's also the community that has the least problems with drug use. So churches up here really, they're a really interesting space. So in most of the associational fixed effects models, you see more churches are good for opioids, reducing opioid, they're good for not. Of course, in the qualitative work, you see this very sort of folks are low-income folks in the communities that we're in really don't feel comfortable in churches, right? So there's this ambivalent relationship where they can be both sources of social inclusion for the people in them, and they can be a source of isolation as well.
So in some of these, in Mississippi, there are almost as many churches as Dollar General stores. And they cater to specific Black, white. What you don't have is a donor class, somebody who's willing to set up a Boys and Girls Club.
Right.
Sports are great, but somebody's got to, clear the fields and so forth. So it's just, there's no real middle class, it seems to me,
That's absolutely right. Yeah. The communities are deeply unequal and at both stratum, and they lack these spaces where people come together.
Non-example and the example community. Expectations for one's future, and if there's option time, or if kind of be able to take the job I can get with a criminal conviction and the job I can get without a criminal conviction is basically the incentives to do or not do are so different, because if the rural areas I know they've got the splash pads and
so the rural communities in Minnesota have a lot more social infrastructure, at least in the ones so Kathy and Tim go on this epic road trip up there too, and so you do see sort of more. There's a breakfast place where tons of people are gathering every morning, and so I do think there are more examples of social infrastructure built in those communities. I'm familiar with sort of the phenomenon that you're thinking about, but I will say I think a lot of the social isolation in these places stems from, or at least the respondents would say stem from, both no opportunity for social connection, but also complicating that, the next factor, which is significant violence in the community. Yeah.
So kind of a related thing I'm thinking about is the availability of teen employment opportunities. So that's both a social infrastructure thing and an economic opportunity thing, but
virtually devoid, in these communities.
So I'm curious, when you're talking about policy implications, we're thinking about we could build some things to do in the
Libraries, yeah. Yeah.
And I was just thinking like, if we have a set source of resources, it seems like some of your other work is talking about how these families just don't have cash. How would you think about this trade-off between using money to build things to create more community versus just giving the money to the people who are
Good.
most in need?
Yeah, so one thing that we can absolutely see is like cash transfers do better at sort of being equally distributed across the the country. So if I do something like I don't know, an expanded child tax credit, let's just say, and want to reduce cut child poverty to all-time low, but I can also be sure that it's going to get to the rural families. So when we get to policy implications, we do believe like direct transfers that go to people are more equally distributed. Anytime you it has, how much people get is related to the number of grant writers. Like you're not going to get equal distribution of the funds. But I do think that there's also, I'm quite attracted to the idea of like concrete investments in social infrastructure, right? So I'm less into like giving money to elites and communities and say, do with it what you think will be best for the communities, because the folks running communities, many of them are wonderful and well-intentioned, but there's also like centuries of sort of a fight between the haves and the have-nots, and usually that money is going to the haves. But I do think I'm quite attracted to the idea of like building libraries in other places, and I think it would be something that communities would actually, they'd be visible signs of investment in meeting the needs. That is not something that I think we do a lot of. And in fact, many of the funding streams related to economic development in the country are like prohibited from these things because they're thought to be sort of, not serious. Yeah.
So this is a deliberately dumb and naive question.
Love this.
Maybe it's in the book. If you ask people if this is not a great place, why don't they leave?
They move. Yeah.
Or why doesn't Wisconsin send a bunch of moving? Maybe the best policy, we're short of workers, send some moving vans, grab some people and.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because like the last sort of flow of jobs into these places actually comes from the north. So I'm giving too much to Raj's chart, so I'm going to go to, I'm changing my slide. Like in Greenwood, Mississippi, one of the big games in town for a while was Milwaukee Tool, which I'll give you a guess where it came from. So it would be interesting to think, and you could think of like the Great Migration as the last example, right? So why don't they do that? Well, I do think we now have this great work by Eleanor Darren on court, showing like how northern cities sort of change, right, and become less places of opportunity as a result of the Great Migration. So right now, I think I don't know if there would get takers. There's actually a lot more sort of reverse migration back to communities. I don't know that we saw it totally in the communities that we were in. Maybe it's more in urban centers. Why don't people leave is, I think, a question we continue to have to puzzle over. One thing is that like people really are like connected. Many people really are connected to the land like that they grow up in, right? And there are like wonderful things about all of these communities. I mean, the Spinach Festival in Crystal City is a sight to see. I recommend it to everyone. You can get your picture with Popeye. So for all of their problems, like there is this sort of connection. And actually, one of the best human capital things you see is a lot of people who have had successful careers other places actually come back near the end to try to give back to their communities. In this one community, we were in South Carolina, actually, one of the girls who signed one of the first cases that culminated in Brown v. Board, she was like a first grader. She had actually gotten through high school and gone to college, had a successful career and was back. So I think we can't underestimate like the connection that people have to place. And then there are this question of like, you're in some sort of social network, and leaving for another place seems completely foreign, right? And leaving does cost money. So, Much like other Americans, I think poor folks are risk averse and they sort of know what they have now.
Were you fishing for the housing answer there, Kurt? Housing costs?
A
lot of spatial.
Yeah, yeah.
So super interesting.
Oh, wait, I see.
Not to belabor the point, but I think, beyond economic opportunity, when we talk about why people stay or go, have good ideas that folks it's not just about a job, right? And there's like those of us who are elites think of mobility as a very good thing and are happy to pick up and move across the country. But what you're talking about, folks who've been rooted in areas, and Luke, you know this because you're in the Detroit area, around unionization and stuff, it becomes almost a legacy of being in a family. So, but aside from that, I had a question about Tim's point about there's no middle class. And so if you all looked at like, what is the share of leavers from these places? Right? Like, meaning, is it like social infrastructure piece? How do you get social infrastructure in a place when middle class has completely left? Do we know like how much of that is driving the outcomes that you're finding? Is that some of these places have disproportionate leavers? And if that's the case, what does that mean for addressing these kinds of deep inequities? And then the follow-up question to that is that I super appreciate the focus on history. You're focusing kind of on Appalachian, the Cotton Belt, and then South Texas. These are all really marginalized groups, marginalized in arguably really different ways with some overlap.
Yes.
So what
Parallel.
drawing conclusions on, and like, what does that mean for potential recommendations for remedies, given these really kind of different forms of marginalization?
Yeah, so I think the outmigration is an issue. It is, these are mostly places that I think persistently have had very little middle class, right? So there was this period, I think, where industrialization comes to the South, and maybe there was like a positive moment there. And then NAFTA happens, and these places just are like gutted of that, right? So there was like almost a sense that that we were going to build sort of an industrial, sort of middle class, at the expense of Wisconsin and Michigan in these communities, and then that all disappears. First in NAFTA, and then in the China boom. And actually, this book has us thinking like very differently about like the losers of trade and also the political consequences. So a new NBR working paper shows like the places that are most impacted by NAFTA sort of swing to be the most sort of nationalistic and conservative, and I think arguably elected the last person who was president. So I maybe there was a little bit of middle class, but this sort of like has and have nots is persistent, right? It's sort of a story, sort of the fight between, these have always been unequal places. So you do, I think qualitatively have a lot of reason to buy into sort of the what sometimes people refer to as the brain drain, right? That like we can see lots of examples, and I think there's some empirical work to support this, that like if somebody seems like they might be talented and be able to go, like the community sort of comes around them to like get them out. And so that is a challenge, right? When like a lot of your talent is leaving, it's difficult to know what to do. Yeah.
Long time ago, the book All Our Kin made a big impression on me. And when you talked here about social infrastructure, but a lot of what you highlighted was sort of physical social infrastructure.
Yeah.
So these kind of things that are highlighted in All Our Kin, which is sort of informal insurance networks and things like that, is that part of your notion of social infrastructure, and how is that doing in these communities?
Yeah, so they're related concepts, but the social, we think of social infrastructure as the actual places that we can build, right? And like where people make the connections and the opportunity. And then the social networks are like the social capital that we're building. And so that can be bridging social capital or bonding social capital. I think, right, my read is like the bridging social capital is the stuff we care about. Like if we can connect people on the extremes, we actually can have better sort of employment and mobility outcomes. The bonding, I would say, like, I'm gonna have to skip over the violence part of the talk, which is pretty depressing anyway, so you can read about that. In all of the places that we're in, like, social connections are deeply frayed. Think about the opioid crisis, right? So part of this, like, isolation, I think, is driven by the fact that my kin is dangerous, right? So I have sort of these examples where people talk about, like, I let somebody come and live with me. They said they'd be there for a few days, and then they're there for months, and they're stealing my money, right? So there is that sort of causing us to become socially isolated, and then violence, which I again thought of was as a really an urban problem before I went in, but after we sort of clean up some of our challenges with data, like especially the Delta and Appalachia, like the rates of violence are equivalent and sometimes maybe even higher than what we would see in a Chicago, which gets a lot of attention. And so that really leads people to withdraw from social networks, right? So if I go out, it's like pitting against the exact thing I'm saying that we need to do, which is, like, if I fear that I'm going to be shot at, then I'm going to be in my community and try to talk to as few people as possible. And so I guess I take a much more ambivalent view towards social kin than all our kin did, in terms of both the benefits of social support and bridging, obviously, but also, like, the downsides of being social networks that sort of expose me to more trouble. I want to talk to you about corruption really quick. I'll just be the last thing I do. But one of my saddest things about the book is, like, the Brett Favre scandal actually happens in the community we happen to be in the field on. And we were looking forward to breaking this nationally. But of course, his text messages came out. And so Brett Favre took 1 point. He's a Super Bowl win. Oh, sorry. To remind other people, but maybe not in Wisconsin. Quarterback takes 1.1 million for speeches that there's no record that he actually took. And this is what hits the national news. Of course, his text messages come out. He had said, "I didn't know where the money came from. I had no idea." And the text message comes out that says, "Will anybody be able to figure out where the money came from?" Which is usually a good sign that you know that you're not doing something you should be doing. This is only like a small tip of a much bigger iceberg, right? It's an $80 million biggest public corruption scandal in the state of Mississippi. Actually comes from temporary assistance for needy families, the block grant that we thought was a welfare program, but it's really just a very flexible set of money. And Brett gets 1.1 million, but they're former pro wrestlers who get a lot of money. There's one former pro wrestler who gets money to give speeches about substance abuse, like avoiding getting addicted to drugs, but he actually gets addicted to drugs, and so TANF money is used to send him to, like, a $64,000 rehab center in Malibu, California. So it's just like an incredible story, very sensational. But every single community that we're in has actually some story of public corruption. So in Crystal City, where we're in 2016, the FBI descends on City Hall and arrests every member of the city council except for one, the mayor and the city manager, for bribery, like taking bribes, racketeering, as well. I think there was some illegal gambling going on. And Marion County, South Carolina, there was like a diaper factory that was going to come, that was given a huge amount of money, and then it turned out it was entirely a sham. And then, of course, in Appalachia, there's like they've got the lockdown on this. This actually the same family who was mayor of the town, like in the 1860s, like the descendants are mayor in like the early 2000s, ends up getting put away for taking bribes, for racketeering, for being in league with drug dealers in the community. But a set of reformers actually takes this guy and his slate on in like 2006, says we're going to clean up government. And they win in 2006 and take over in Manchester, Kentucky. But in the process of doing so, they actually end up in jail themselves because they were buying votes, which turns out is illegal. And so they were seen buying votes because the Dahl White group they were also buying votes, and they saw them. So because they were going to jail. So, and then of course, there's this great guy, Ed Kahn, I think, is a disability lawyer who ends up going to jail because he's been paying off Social Security judges basically to deem people as disabled. And then if you're the lawyer, you get some amount of those benefits over time. And he flees to Bermuda and like they come and get him. So the thing that I think is interesting about corruption, right, is one, it completely, in the case of Mississippi, it's like literally taking money out of the pockets of poor families, right? But in all of these other cases, it's like diverting the attention of government, right? These are supposed to be the folks that are working on behalf of poor residents, and they're busy sort of lining their own pockets. And if you go to any one of these communities, my prediction is, if you ask them like, why has your community been so poor for so long? My prediction is that they will all say something about that the poor don't work hard enough, or probably not doing what they should. And they will say nothing about sort of corruption, right? And there will often have been a recent case, right? But corruption of local officials is like a one-off problem, right? It's sort of innocent until proven guilty. And so you can see this, I think, juxtaposition of the narrative where poor folks in these communities are generally deemed guilty until proven innocent, sort of play out and sort of what are the problems that we think are really the problems and not. So there was a wonderful sort of example of a 3,600 person march right around the same time of these sort of corruption scandals I was mentioning in Manchester, Kentucky. That brought people together, and in each one of these places, you can see like there are good things happening. There are people who are really trying. Maybe they're coming together in a way that they haven't, but we're all sort of implicated in this. And when we think of things like social infrastructure and corruption, it sort of turns the lens from thinking about how we need to change poor folks to like how we need to change communities to work better for everyone. And I hope sort of opens up sort of a new set of like anti-poverty interventions, like maybe we should try to tackle local corruption, which is also, I think our best game in town is like local journalism can be in each one of these cases, except for the FBI scandal. All the other ones, like it was local journalism that actually broke this stuff. And, that's something that we're disinvesting in over time.
You might not have like an answer for this, but I'm trying to go against this counterfactual that, okay, say these corruption scandals hadn't happened in this one-off, right? We're treating them sort of as these extraordinary events. But do you really have evidence that it's actually quite an ordinary event? And then if there's no corruption, is the counterfactual really that these communities are better off?
Yeah.
I also want to qualify that by saying it like I subscribe to what you were just saying about the fact that the narrative is often that the poor are guilty till proven innocent and everyone else is innocent till proven guilty.
Yeah, so what we can see is we don't have a very good sense of how common corruption is across the country because we can see cases, but the number of cases that are brought is a function in part of like how much we invest in the apparatus, which we don't invest a whole bunch in, like of actually finding out who's corrupt. If I overlaid a map of perceived corruption, which I have in another deck, it would look a lot like our map of disadvantage, right? So if you go from a representative survey, if you ask people how corrupt is your government, the poorest communities will say, we believe our government is the most corrupt of any community. So there is a correlation between like how people view government and sort of the level of disadvantage, which I think makes a lot of other sense. So to really test this, and the other thing I will say is that like this has been tested a little bit. There have been some stories that have looked at this. There have been some studies that look at this internationally, and I think are able to use a bit more of like exogenous variation to test it. But we're a long way from sort of, you know, empirically substantiating the causal claim. Yeah.
I just kind of am like to me, corruption just seems more like the symptom as opposed to the cause. Like this is a place where the people can't leverage power to have accountability for their officials. It's clearly a place where it's kind of easy to take advantage of the situation. So I guess I don't really see the like kind of causal story here.
Yeah, so I see it as a mechanism of if like what do we expect the players are who are going to actually change things. And it's our expectation, I think, generally speaking, that like government structure should actually be about making the citizenry better off. And if they're disproportionately less likely to do that in places that are poor, I would argue it's at least a mechanism by which deep disadvantage is perpetuated over time, like an extracting of the resources. I know I've got like 4 more minutes.
I'll squeeze it in. I'm fully on board, of course, with thinking about implications with regard to structural changes, right? What can we do to address it? There's one structural, I think, story that I haven't heard you talk about, and maybe it's in the book, and that's related to incarceration. So if you took a map of enslavement in 1860, your IDD index and incarceration rates, they would all mirror each other almost identically.
Yeah.
I was surprised to not see it in index, but you know, I can understand why, but then it's also not showing up in your mechanism. So I'm just curious, how do you see that? Where do you see that in the story?
Yeah, you know, we heard less of it in the communities that we're in. So there is some story about like people being incarcerated. Like you do hear about community members, but they, you know, there could be like kind of a sampling frame issue, right? That like we don't hear about it because the people aren't. And so, yeah, it could be something that needs to be accounted for. It's clearly there. We do talk about it in terms of as a perpetuation of like the forced labor. So in Mississippi, like the penal farms still are like very much in effect. So in our last chapter, the social reproduction, you actually see people who are like in the communities that we're in, like they're out on work release program. They're being charged for their incarceration and then they're like working it off, right? And then actually we write about how in one of the communities, like they all come and visit the local soup kitchen for lunch. So they go and like clean the roads and then come into the soup kitchen for lunch and then go back to their work. And there's an interesting question of like, are they being charged for the lunch that they're getting at a sort of philanthropic food pantry? So we get in that a little bit, but I agree. It could be something that we should be talking more about. Definitely though, we're talking about it in the lines of like the reproduction of the same pattern, right? And sort of putting it into the same context of the patterns of like subjugation that we've seen over a long term.
I was just gonna, so given we only heard a few of the list, but the list is modestly comprehensive, save for incarceration. Journalists, arcades, these seem like they're not possibly gonna make a dent in the sort of cycle of despair that you've described. So is there any hope? I mean, is there like
yes,
federal government taking over like what, which I'm not saying the federal government knows what to do either, but it doesn't seem like those, you know, we live in a community controlled, you know, devolved set of governments and communities. And given that, it seems like there might not be much that can be done. Help me understand. I'm sorry, I love journalists. I'd like
Yeah,
decades.
yeah, yeah.
Like, I'm gonna-
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so like in my own career, like the first my first book was nice because there was like one answer, that like maybe giving families with kids a little bit of money is a good idea. And this one is one where I think there's like gotta be 100 answers. And I think you're right that more money for local journalism isn't the only answer, but like we could actually try. Like we could actually try to make the governance of poor communities more equitable. Local journalism can play a role, but of course, like the federal government could do more.
But at the end of the day, someone else will get voted in, right? So it's still a community who voting for.
This is
You can
places
bail me out.
where the Infrastructure Act, local connectivity. Get people connected to the internet at low cost. They can form their own groups. They can get direct deposit from the ITC and the CTC and things like that without, just have a bank account and so forth. So the Federal Infrastructure Act could really help here by developing connectivity, which allows, I know lots of bad things, but lots of good things, maybe in places like this, where people can get together.
Yeah, so I guess the way I will push back is that we were in this juxtaposition of like anything we do feels like a drop in the bucket, and it does when you sort of look at like the century of stasis. But if we take that, we don't do anything at all. And so like trying to find mechanisms and think differently about what we should be doing, and it's got to be like 100 things, right? Like if any of these communities actually did better in regulating local government, actually training people who want to be in local government to do it well. That's the other thing is like anybody who cares that like comes into office in these places has like no support whatsoever. Connecting them to connecting people to the outside world, and building libraries. Like I think it's gotta be like a multidimensional set of actions that have any chance of moving the needle. But I understand your skepticism.
I'm just, we're at time, so folks can follow up with questions.